The Machinery of the Mind, by Dion. Introduction. Initially delivered as a series of public discourses, this concise volume makes no claim to augment the formidable canon of psychological literature. It is addressed to those possessing neither the leisure nor the requisite training to master seminal treatises on the subject, yet who desire to comprehend its rudiments, to discern the principles governing character formation, and to grasp the mechanisms of the thought process, not merely from a scholastic perspective, but in relation to the exigencies of daily existence. It is the author's aspiration that many shall discover within these pages the solution to enigmas that have long confounded their own natures, for only those harboring such unresolved complexities within their hearts can truly appreciate their debilitating and agonizing influence. This volume aspires less to a systematic exposition of the elements of psychology than to the implantation of certain fundamental concepts within uninitiated minds, that they may serve as a foundation for subsequent inquiry. To this end, the author has adopted a pictorial, almost diagrammatic mode of presentation, ensuring the formation of a conceptual framework into which specific details may subsequently be integrated. Experience has demonstrated this to be the optimal method for conveying novel concepts to minds unaccustomed to metaphysical subtleties. The tenets of no specific school of psychology are strictly observed. The author acknowledges a debt to all whilst pledging allegiance to none, maintaining that in the absence of a universally accepted standard of authority within psychological science, each student must evaluate the doctrines presented for his acceptance in the light of his personal experience. This treatise is fundamentally pragmatic in its objective, composed to address a tangible necessity. In her experience with remedial psychology, the author observed that numerous instances of mental and nervous distress might never have manifested had the sufferers possessed a rudimentary understanding of the mind's operations. She further ascertained that many patients necessitated only an elucidation of these principles to initiate their recovery. Moreover, even when further intervention was requisite to achieve a cure, such knowledge significantly accelerated the treatment by enabling the patient to cooperate with intelligence. To the best of her knowledge, there exists no volume addressing psychopathology not from the perspective of the academic, but from that of the patient requiring a fundamental comprehension of mental laws to facilitate hygienic thought. This work has been composed to satisfy that precise deficiency. It is applicable, however, not solely to those afflicted by mental or situational infirmity, but also to those who seek to cultivate their latent capacities through the practical application of the laws of thought and character. Chapter 1. The Biological Basis of Consciousness. To attain a comprehensive understanding of mental processes, it is essential to possess a conception of the mechanism whereby the mind interfaces with the corporeal frame. Permeating every segment of our organism is a reticulum of specialized fibers, the function of which is to convey nervous impulses from the sensory organs to the central nervous system, comprising the brain and spinal cord, and subsequently outward to the muscles, glands, and other reactive organs. The sensory organs function as receptors of sensation, the nerve fibers as transmitters, the central nervous system as a grand telephonic exchange, and the muscles, glands, and organs as the executors of the mind's impulses. Sensory organs comprise cells, or aggregations thereof, specialized for the reception of specific categories of impressions. That is to say, should the particular stimulus they are adapted to receive be applied to them, an alteration, ostensibly of a chemical classification, occurs within their substance. This, it is posited, generates energy of an electrical nature which propagates along the nerve fiber as though along a wire. At this juncture, however, our knowledge regarding the nature of the nervous impulse remains provisional and hypothetical. Akin to all other living tissue, the nervous system is constituted by millions of specialized cells. These cells comprise a primary cell body possessing extensions, typically binary in number. One of these exhibits a proliferation of branching fibers resembling the root system of a plant and is designated the dendrite. The other consists of an elongated filament, the terminus of which diverges into strands, much as the end of a length of worsted might be unraveled. This process is designated the axon. The filamentous branches of the axon of one cell interlace with those of the dendrite of another, and a nervous impulse, descending the nerve fibers, traverses the interval in the same manner that an electric current jumps the gap between the terminals of an arc lamp. It becomes immediately apparent that these interlacing fibrils, numbering in the millions and ramifying throughout every portion of the anatomy, establish a most marvelous system of communication, wherein the brain and spinal cord act as a central telephonic exchange. Muscles are composed of elongated, fusiform cells capable of contraction. Chemical transformations are incessantly transpiring within their substance. The blood and lymph that perfuse them deliver nutritive materials and remove the metabolic waste products of their activity. These nutritive substances, which are highly complex chemical compounds, are deposited within the body of the cell. Upon the reception of a nervous impulse, these nutrient globules, as it were, undergo rapid disintegration, that is to say, they dissociate into their constituent chemical elements, and the energy utilized to construct them is liberated during the process, performing the labor for which the muscle is designed. The glands act as the chemists of the body, and within the crucibles of their minute cells, they execute the living chemistry upon which our vital functions are predicated. The glands serve as the regulators of every process of the body. Chapter 2. Evolution of the nervous architecture. The most efficacious method of comprehending the organization of our intricate nervous architecture is to examine its evolution from its modest origins within the most rudimentary forms of life. In the single-celled animalcule, the most primordial type of living creature, a solitary cell executes all vital functions. It locomotes, respires, assimilates, excretes, and perceives. With the emergence of multicellular organisms, however, distinct cells are assigned specialized tasks and are compelled to perform those specific duties to the exclusion of all others. Consequently, it becomes imperative that coordination be maintained between the sensory organs that detect the quarry and the musculature that mobilizes to facilitate its capture, and for this objective, specific cells are utilized to specialize in communication. Thus, it becomes apparent that the functional unit of the nervous system is not the isolated nerve cell, but rather what is designated the sensor-motor arc, consisting of a nerve conveying the incoming sensation from a sensory organ and establishing contact with a separate nerve that transmits the outgoing impulse to a muscle or organ. When a multiplicity of muscles becomes available for movement, it becomes requisite to further interconnect the sensor-motor arc. In order that additional components of the structure may be engaged and the response not be restricted to a solitary muscle, nerve cells establish loops upon the arcs, and loops upon those loops, fostering further intercommunications among themselves. The organization becomes progressively more elaborate, permitting increasingly intricate reactions to stimuli, until ultimately the marvelous complexities of the human brain are realized. Chapter 3. Cognition through classification. When an impression is rendered upon a sensory organ, the sensation derived therefrom is transmitted via the connecting neural fiber to the brain, and they're transmuted, through a mechanism of which we remain wholly ignorant, from a sensation into a thought. We postulate that the intellect acquires, Through experience, the capacity to correlate specific categories of sensation with distinct objects or environmental conditions. Consequently, when the mind perceives these particular stimuli, it deduces the presence of said objects and constructs mental representations or conceptual models designed to embody them. The veracity of our perception is established by the fidelity with which our conceptual model corresponds to its external prototype. A precise replication constitutes a valid concept, whereas an imperfect reproduction results in an inaccurate concept. We identify an object through a process of classification, observing its resemblance or dissimilarity to entities previously comprehended. When an unfamiliar entity commands our attention, we subject it to a comparative analysis until we ascertain the specific compartment within our conceptual imagery to which it ought to be allocated. Should we fail to locate an exact correspondence, we deposit the object within the most appropriate category discoverable, subsequently segregating a distinct subdivision for it. Thereby, we acknowledge its identity in essentials and its divergence in details from the other occupants of that classification. By way of illustration, assuming we were to disembark upon an island and an object upon the shore attracted our scrutiny, we would endeavor to discern which class of previously experienced phenomena it most nearly approximated. We would observe its movements, and should we perceive quadrupedal limbs and hair, we would assign it to the order of living creatures, concluding it to be an animal. If, however, we noted an erect posture, raiment, and armaments, recognizing these as characteristics of humanity, yet perceived that its complexion differed in hue from that of any human being we had ever before encountered, we would delineate a fresh subdivision within that province of the mind wherein our concepts regarding mankind are stored. We would situate it therein, and likely bestow upon it a distinguishing appellation by means of which we might designate it to other human beings. Assuming, however, that we subsequently encountered another entity of the identical nature, we would be under no obligation to create a novel subdivision. Rather, we would classify it alongside the previously examined specimen, and thus we would possess the conviction on this occasion that we comprehended its identity. Indeed, the process of cognition is intrinsically a process of classification, and we perceive that we understand an entity once we have allocated it to a satisfactory niche among our concepts. Chapter 4. Strata of the Conscious Mind. Those lacking formal instruction in psychology generally postulate the mind as a homogeneous entity. Our initial disciplined inquiry reveals, however, that the mental apparatus is possessed of an organization quite as structural as that of the corporeal frame. The structural arrangement of the psyche may best be conceptualized by visualizing a vessel across which, at distinct elevations, are interspersed sieves of varying gradations of permeability. One must envision the mind as being constituted of specific strata, and the stratum wherein our conscious existence maintains its most permanent locus we shall designate the outermost layer, termed the focus of consciousness. Situated immediately posterior to the focus of consciousness lies the tier which psychologists classify as the fringe of consciousness, and these two are demarcated from one another by a filtration mechanism technically referred to as a sensor. The elucidation of these two mental levels may be rendered more intelligible if we subsequently examine the functional applications to which they are dedicated. Let us posit a hypothetical scenario wherein an individual is seated within a chamber attending to a lecture. Of what phenomena will he be cognizant? His attention will primarily concentrate upon the discourse, and, secondarily, he will remain dimly perceptive of the auditory disturbances generated by the vehicular traffic in the exterior thoroughfare. Through a volitional exertion, he will direct his attention exclusively toward those ideas associated with the lecture, whilst banishing from consciousness those pertaining to the traffic. Alternatively, to articulate the process in psychological terminology, we may assert that all ideations connected with the lecture are granted admission to the focus of consciousness, whereas all impressions associated with the street clamor are detained within the fringe of consciousness, with the censor sieve calibrated such that ideas in the fringe are precluded from intruding upon the focus. Its interstices may be envisioned as possessing dimensions such that only the concise concepts appertaining to the lecture may permeate them, whilst the amorphous impressions connected with the street traffic are impeded. It becomes readily apparent that our faculties of concentration are contingent upon the efficacious functioning of this psychic filtration system. The greater the degree to which we can bring the regulation of its meshes under voluntary command, the superior our powers of concentration shall prove. Conversely, should the mesh be lax or defective, and should we have acquired negligible control over it, we shall discover an inability to adhere to any consecutive train of thought, and that our focus of consciousness is perpetually susceptible to invasion by ideas alien to the subject matter upon which we desire to attend. These two strata, the focus and fringe of consciousness, collectively constitute that which is designated the conscious mind. This represents the portion of the psyche which most authentically appears to constitute the self. It is the domain of the mind wherein we execute all our conscious mental operations, yet it is by no means the totality of the mental edifice. Situated immediately posterior to the fringe of consciousness lies the mental level known as the FORECONSCIOUS, PRECONSCIOUS, and various other appellations, contingent upon the specific school of psychology whose doctrines are espoused. If, however, its functional role is comprehended, it shall be readily recognized notwithstanding the disguise of the variegated nomenclature which, unfortunately, complicates the study of psychology. Within this stratum of the mind are deposited all ideas retained in memory, yet which are not currently the subject of active cogitation. It may, in fact, be defined as the level of conscious memory. Furthermore, just as the focus is segregated from the fringe of consciousness by an adjustable censor sieve, so too does an identical sieve interpose between the fringe of consciousness and the foreconscious, operating upon precisely the same principles. Thus, the scholar attending the lecture could modulate this second sieve so as to permit all that he had previously acquired relevant to the subject at hand to ascend into the focus of consciousness, thereby facilitating his comprehension of the discourse. It is this faculty which is of such paramount importance in defining the organization of the mind, for the previously established ideas, ascending through the sieves alongside the fresh concepts presented for consideration, serve as standards of valuation and formulate a concurrent commentary upon the lecture. These three levels collectively, the focus, the fringe, and the foreconscious, constitute the stratum of the mind to which we possess access and of which we can derive meaning. However, we must note this caveat regarding these levels. Any idea which we may desire to contemplate must be positioned within the intense illumination of the focus of consciousness before it may be perceived with clarity. We cannot contemplate an idea whilst it remains within the foreconscious, yet we may, at will, retrieve it from the foreconscious and situate it within the focus of consciousness for our scrutiny. Indeed, these three mental levels may be analogized to a culinary environment. The foreconscious acting as the cupboard, the fringe of consciousness as the work table, and the focus of consciousness as the mixing basin. The ideas from these three levels may be represented by the ingredients of a confection, some of which are stored within the cupboard, some lie ready to hand upon the table, and others are currently within the mixing basin undergoing agitation. Those upon the table, resembling the ideas in the fringe of consciousness, lie proximate to the cook's hand, yet she is not manipulating them at the present moment. Those in the cupboard are obscured from sight, yet she is cognizant of their presence and can retrieve them should she so desire. However, it is exclusively those within the basin, the focus of consciousness, upon which she is actively laboring. To the layman, these three levels constitute the entirety of his mental existence. He possesses no conception of the enigmatic hinterland situated behind the narrow strip of civilized coast. Yet it is here that the wellsprings of his being originate, and it is the discovery and exploration of this hinterland which has represented the seminal contribution of modern psychology to the compendium of human knowledge. Chapter 5. The Lower Psychic Domains. Within the mental stratum designated as the subconscious or unconscious are deposited all ideations to which we possess no immediate access. Certain psychologists posit that the memory of every impression ever received via a sensory organ is registered herein, much like an image upon a photographic plate. Nevertheless, this tenet is not universally embraced. It may be asserted with considerable security, however, that the recollection of any event that has left a distinct imprint upon the mind is preserved within this domain and performs its function in our mental existence. Situated between the subconscious and the foreconscious lies the mind's great primary sensor sieve, and it is this mechanism that is indicated whenever this sensor is cited within psychoanalytical literature. This sensor sieve is of paramount significance within the mental economy, for upon its operation the very health of the psyche is substantially dependent. Should its meshes prove excessively lax, we experience a surge into consciousness of ideas that ought never to reside therein. Conversely, were they to be unduly constricted, the conscious mind is severed from the wellspring of its vitality, the subconscious. This sieve is constructed upon the identical principles governing the two previously examined. However, it possesses one fundamental distinction. It is not subject to the dominion of the will. The dimension of its mesh is regulated, not by that which I may arbitrarily desire at the moment, but by that which the prevailing tenor of my character may determine. The foreconscious, therefore, may be analogized to a reference library, whereas the vast repository of the subconscious constitutes a vault wherein the archives are secured. And although the majority of these contents never impinge upon the conscious mind, it is their indirect influence that establishes the tone of the character. The most remote stratum of the mind, the functioning of which is purely automatic, holds dominion over all the vital operations of the body. Its mental processes direct the activities of the spinal tier of the nervous system, whereas the other levels of the mind utilize the brain as their physical organ of manifestation. This is substantiated by the fact that a pathology of the brain can disrupt the reasoning faculties while leaving the purely physiological nervous functions intact, whereas an affliction of the spinal cord may render inoperative the nervous processes of the bodily functions, even though the mental processes remain unimpaired. The psychic operations of this remote mind govern its biochemical processes, and it is this stratum which controls the involuntary musculature, regulates the vascular supply to any region of the anatomy, and oversees the output of the ductless glands and consequently the chemical composition of the blood. It is these facts that may well illuminate the genesis of numerous. Chapter 6. The Formation of Idea Complexes. Having scrutinized the stratifications into which the mind is divided, we must subsequently consider the nature of the material deposited therein. And to achieve this, we must examine the mechanisms of memory. Upon the entry of an idea into the psyche, it seldom persists as an autonomous entity for any protracted duration. It appears to be a fundamental characteristic of ideas that they forge alliances among themselves, and these aggregations of concepts are technically designated as complexes. A complex may be likened to the branching proliferation of a pondweed. It possesses a central nucleus from which ramify threads that divide and subdivide, extending in every direction and interconnecting with other systems of ideas that possess analogous branching filaments. Consequently, should a notion concerning any subject penetrate our consciousness, we discover that it is not a solitary unit, but rather one terminus of a concatenation that diverges into myriad collateral matters. We have not engaged a single line of thought, but an entire railway infrastructure. These conceptual systems proliferate and extend through every stratum of the mind, yet if we trace them sufficiently far, we shall invariably ascertain that they possess their roots in one of the profound primal instincts, situated deep within the subconscious. It is from these sources that they derive the vitality binding them together, for all complexes possess an emotional nucleus, and it is from the instincts that emotions emanate. Let us select an illustration from tangible existence to observe the operation of these principles. A gentleman may, for instance, be engaged in the vocation of a grocer. He will, therefore, possess a grocer's complex, which is to imply that all his ideas pertaining to the commerce of household commodities will be linked together such that, should a train of thought be initiated in connection with any single aspect of his business, via a facile transition, a multitude of other facets may drift into his mental field. Now, the purveyance of groceries is not, intrinsically, an engrossing subject comparable to literature or science, yet the man maintains an interest in it. And wherefore? Because his grocery complex finds its root in his instinct of self-preservation, for it constitutes the instrumentality by which he sustains his existence. Should his mercantile endeavors flourish, he experiences gratification because it signifies a more ample and agreeable existence for him. Should it diminish, he experiences panic and trepidation because his means of sustaining life are imperiled. Moreover, independent of his status as a grocer, he may serve as an elder of the local chapel and possess an extensive complex of religious interests ramifying, interlacing, and possessing their instinctive roots in his subconscious, precisely as his grocery complex does. Subsequently, on a given day, he may be researching the current valuation of pepper in his trade catalog, and from pepper his thoughts transition to spices in general. Their pungent aroma evokes the notion of incense, and he inquires of himself whether ritualism is ever permissible. It will herein be observed that a trailing tendril of his grocery complex has established contact with his religious complex and drawn it into consciousness. Furthermore, our grocer may contemplate entering into matrimony, and immediately his grocery complex extends a lateral shoot which strikes root in his reproductive instinct, and his interest in provisions is reinforced by much of the interest accumulating around sexuality in his life, for it is upon the prosperity of his business that his prospect of marriage is contingent. Thus, it becomes apparent that the mind is replete with a ramifying agglomeration of complexes which protrude branches in every direction, and that if the terminus of any thread be grasped, by gently exerting traction upon it, we can draw all the complexes with which it is connected into consciousness. This constitutes the mechanism of memory, and even if an idea has been consigned to oblivion, that is, transited from the conscious into the subconscious, it remains feasible to retrieve it by exploiting this propensity of ideas to adhere to one another. For by applying gentle traction upon those components of the complex to which it is affiliated, and which reside within consciousness, the ramifications situated within the subconscious may be coaxed into the light. It is upon this very factor that psychoanalysis predicates a significant portion of its endeavors. Ideas exhibit a tendency to aggregate into complexes in accordance with certain well-defined principles. All concepts pertaining to the identical subject tend to become associated. Ideas entering the psyche simultaneously tend to form associations. For instance, should I sustain a grievous fall upon a banana peel whilst proceeding to the pillar box? When I behold bananas, I shall contemplate falls and pillar boxes, and when I behold pillar boxes, I may reflect upon bananas and falls. Concepts of cause and effect become intrinsically linked. Ideas possessing any manner of resemblance, whether fundamental or superficial, tend to evoke one another. Thus, if I contemplate sausages, I may be reminded of zeppelins, and if I reflect upon the fall on the banana peel, my mind may leap to the Niagara Falls or fallen women. This irrational mode of cognition is of paramount importance in applied psychology, for much of the thinking conducted by the subconscious mind is performed in this manner, and it gives rise to that peculiar method of thought which shall be addressed in the chapter concerning symbolism. Chapter 7. The Three Primary Instincts. Having previously conceptualized the mind as a reservoir partitioned into distinct chambers by filtration mechanisms of varying porosity, let us now direct our attention to the currents traversing the fluid that occupies this vessel. We may schematically envisage the influx as entering through a singular primary conduit into the subconscious, where it subsequently diverges into three distinct tributaries. This principal channel of energy, which furnishes the motive force for all sentient beings, has been accorded a multiplicity of appellations. Libido, horme, elon vital, and biourge. An apposite English equivalent is the thrust of life. This stream of psychic energy undergoes specialization within the individual, separating into divergent currents which we designate as the three primary instincts. The first of these is the self-preservation instinct. Under this rubric, one may subsume all activities actuated by the will to live or self-maintenance, and the will to live more fully or self-aggrandizement. The second paramount instinct is that of reproduction, or sex, the function of which is to secure the preservation of the species. Through this channel flows the surplus energy remaining after the exigencies of self-maintenance have been satisfied. The third major instinct is the social or herd instinct, a term employed to designate that system of innate proclivities and capacities which empowers us to cooperate with our fellows and engage in social existence, inclusive of all its concomitant advantages and liabilities. Certain animals, however, are devoid of this third instinct and pursue solitary existences, acknowledging no bonds save those of mate and progeny. Conversely, the more highly evolved species, including mankind, have developed this significant specialization of psychic energy which facilitates a communal life. These three cardinal instincts interact reciprocally within the concealed domain of the unconscious, constructing thereby both social organization and individual character. To comprehend the mechanisms of the instincts, however, one must explicitly recognize that their scope is universal rather than personal. The survival or tribulation of the singular unit is not considered within the grand design, for it is the race that is paramount. Should we regard the instincts as subservient solely to the welfare of the individual, we formulate a concept that inevitably misleads us when we endeavor to apply our conclusions practically. The operations of instinct must be observed from the perspective of evolutionary progression, rather than that of individual well-being. This constitutes the vantage point from which nature devises her schemes, and we can aspire to comprehend her methods only if we adopt her perspective. To regard man as actuated primarily by reason is a profound error. Instinct constitutes the mainspring of his action, whilst reason is employed to execute the dictates of instinct. It must be borne in mind, however, that instinct does not function solely in rudimentary physical forms. Man possesses emotions and intellect in addition to a corporeal form, and upon each plane of his being the instincts manifest themselves appropriately, functioning emotionally and intellectually as well as physically. A man employs his intellect as well as his sinew in the struggle for self-preservation. Nor is the sex instinct exhausted merely by the physical act of procreation. Emphasis is placed upon this point, for herein lies the key to the practical application of psychology to human existence. The emotions derive their origins from the instincts. Indeed, an emotion may be said to constitute the subjective aspect of an instinct. Should an instinct attain its objective, we experience gratification. Should it be thwarted, we experience pain. And should we anticipate its frustration, we experience fear. Whenever emotion is present, some underlying instinct must necessarily have been roused into activity. It will thus be perceived how predominant is the influence exerted by the instincts upon our lives. They may, in fact, be considered the fundamental mainsprings of motivation. Previously, psychology concerned itself primarily with reasoning processes, regarding man as a rational being. Indeed, the layperson still views himself as such. However, the investigations of modern psychology have demonstrated that emotion, rather than reason, constitutes the actuating force, and that reason functions merely as an instrument in the service of the emotions. Chapter 8. The drive for self-preservation. The instinct of self-preservation manifests within our consciousness under the aspect of that profound tenacity of existence, that yearning to endure, which distinguishes every sentient entity. It is this very impulse, operating elementally within simply constituted creatures, that compels them to pursue sustenance and evade peril, and simultaneously impels that intricate organism, civilized man, to undertake the labyrinthine endeavors associated with securing a livelihood. Fundamentally, it is an egoistic drive, for it directs the individual to prioritize his own welfare exclusively, and to regard others only inasmuch as their existence is indispensable to his own. To illustrate, the acts of shooting and hunting during the reproductive season are prescribed by law, not arising from any solicitude for the quarry, but rather because the perpetuation of their species proves advantageous to humanity. Its dominion, however, is frequently tempered by two other primary instincts, the sway of which may become so potent under specific conditions as to persuade a man not merely to neglect his own interests, but even to sacrifice his life for the sake of others. In numerous animal species, nevertheless, only two instincts are discernible: self-preservation and reproduction. Yet among those creatures congregated into herds or packs, a third drive evolves, the social instinct. When this phenomenon occurs, the operation of the self-preservation instinct undergoes significant alteration. The individual no longer owes his existence solely to his capacity to contend with his environment, but relies principally upon his ability to maintain his position within the herd, and upon the social organization devolves the burden of adaptation and survival. The sheep that wanders astray is swiftly run to ground. The solitary wolf succumbs to starvation. This veracity applies equally to man, who is, essentially, a social animal. The destitution of Central Europe, amidst the disintegration of social structure ensuing from the war, has demonstrated the impotence of the individual human being and his absolute reliance upon communal existence. The self-preservation instinct, with its relentless operation under the law of natural selection, has provided a thematic foundation for many moralists and sociologists of the materialistic persuasion. Yet they are prone to overlook that the socialization of humanity has transformed the essence of the equation. The unit of survival is no longer the individual, but rather the social organization of which he is a constituent. The law of self-preservation has yielded to the law of group preservation, and the center of psychic gravity has shifted accordingly. The significance of this distinction within practical psychology cannot be overstated. Certain psychologists differentiate the instinct of nutrition from that of self-preservation. However, for all pragmatic intents, they are identical. One must bear in mind, when applying psychological standards to the human character, that within the more highly evolved human typologies, the instinct of self-preservation is not satisfied merely by the prolongation of physical life. There exists a preservation of the personality concurrent with that of bodily existence, and unless a man possesses adequate latitude for self-expression and self-development, he shall endure that sensation of insufficiency and imperfection which characterizes the repression of an instinct. Chapter 9. Disorders of self-assertion. The instinct of self-preservation, deriving its genesis from the sense of individuality, of distinct separateness, constitutes the primary motive of our self-assertion. It is imperative that each constituent of a collective possess a determinate measure of self-assertiveness in order to sustain his station amidst his fellows. Should this attribute, however, deviate either in excess or deficiency from the requisite standard, his continued survival shall be imperiled. If, on the one hand, he manifests a paucity of self-assertion, he shall fail to secure his equitable portion of the vital resources accessible to the aggregate of which he forms a part. Conversely, should his self-assertion prove excessive, it threatens to disrupt the social organization, precipitating either the annihilation of the group or his subsequent expulsion therefrom. A deficiency in the self-preservation instinct is typically attributable to deep-seated psychopathologies, the complexities of which are too intricate to be expounded upon herein. Nevertheless, we may observe in passing that this failure frequently stems from a bifurcation of aims within the subconscious mind. The individual remains uncertain as to which self he is obliged to preserve, and consequently preserves neither. An excess of self-preservation frequently develops within the child who has endured an arduous struggle to ascertain and articulate his individuality. The instinct of self-preservation exerts a profound influence upon vitality. All discerning observers must surely have remarked upon the facility with which the individual who has relinquished his grasp upon existence, or has surrendered hope, succumbs to disease. Chapter 10. The reproductive impulse. The reproductive instinct constitutes nature's apparatus for guaranteeing the perpetuation of the species, and its subjective aspect presents itself to our perception as the aggregate of emotions and sensations associated with sexuality. Once the exigencies of the self-preservation instinct have been satisfied, that is, the moment the individual is secure, adequately nourished, and sufficiently matured, life tends to spill over the vessel it has replenished. It is this psychic pressure that comprises sexual desire. Sexuality, however, must not be contemplated solely regarding its physical demonstrations, for it possesses emotional and intellectual dimensions as well. It represents far more than a mere surplus of energy expended in the act of procreation. It is, furthermore, the yearning for the rejuvenation and vital stimulus engendered by the act of union. Whosoever, when contemplating the human condition, neglects to perceive beyond the physical stratum of the sexual instinct, shall inevitably acquire an erroneous perspective. It has been established as a maxim that psychology and physiology ought to remain strictly segregated. Nevertheless, it is impossible to discourse adequately upon the sexual instinct without examining it under both facets, for sexual activity operates within a psychophysical circle. Organic sensations stimulate the emotions, and conversely, the emotions react upon the organs. A sexual image ascending within the mind precipitates the preliminary reaction of the physical organs destined for its expression, and any excitation of the physical organs, however fortuitous, tends to engender a corresponding emotional state. A stimulus may manifest at any juncture along this psychophysical circuit, and the same principle applies to inhibition. The reproductive instinct constitutes the nucleus of a vast complex, subordinate only to that constellation of ideas centering around the individuality itself. Its energy readily transfers to all concepts and activities that are in any manner associated with the gratification of sexual desire. Attire, the domicile, and one's ambitions, each and all may owe their inherent interest to the reproductive instinct, which utilizes them as conduits for its fulfillment. Chapter 11. Stages of Sexual Maturation. The sexual instinct, in the trajectory of its evolution from its nascent infantile aspect to its mature manifestation, traverses distinct phases which are obscure beyond the purview of psychotherapists, yet are of paramount significance to the pedagogue and the sociologist. The sexuality of the child is fundamentally a capacity for extracting gratification from specific sensibilities, and it is a nebulous and diffused sensation that he experiences. This potentiality, however, as the child advances in age, becomes progressively concentrated upon its physiological channels of activity, and as it achieves this focus, it amplifies in vehemence, much as the tranquil waters of a broad and shallow river become profound and precipitous within a ravine. The interests of a very young child extend only gradually beyond his own somatic sensations, and he therefore maintains an existence that is egocentric beyond any adult conception of the terminology. The organs of reproduction, being densely innervated in anticipation of their future functions, are ascertained to be capable of more acute sensitivity than the remainder of the anatomy, and consequently, they command his attention. This is the autoerotic stage. Furthermore, the manifestations connected with the performance of bodily functions, which appear striking to the child, also solicit his interest. This is the coprophilic stage. Subsequently, his inquisitiveness regarding his own anatomy being satiated, he initiates an inquiry concerning the bodies of others. This is designated the homosexual stage, the phase wherein he evinces interest in bodies of the same sex as his own, yet it might with greater veracity be termed the stage of undifferentiated interest, for the child is interested solely in those who are physiologically constituted like himself, inasmuch as he remains oblivious to the fact that any individuals are fashioned differently. This curiosity being transcended, his interest is transposed to those who differ from himself, irrespective of whether they share a close consanguinity with him or not. Shortly thereafter, however, he commences to differentiate between his immediate kin and those who are less intimately connected. This is denoted by psychologists as the erection of the incest barriers, but to the child, it appears merely as a displacement of the focal point of interest. He is no longer attracted to his mother and sisters, not because he perceives a moral impropriety in harboring such sentiments, but because familiarity breeds contempt, engendering the state of mind articulated in the phrase insipid as sisters' kisses. The child has by this juncture attained the adult orientation towards sexuality, and it remains only for the physical organs to undergo their commensurate development at the onset of puberty for the circuit to be brought to completion. Chapter 12. Deviations in Reproductive Development. Should an individual possess insufficient vitality, he may fail to achieve complete psychic maturation, thereby remaining arrested at one of the primordial developmental stages. Consequently, the adult sexual impulse manifests in an undeveloped guise, identifying the individual as a deviant of a congenital classification. Paradoxical as it may appear, this idiosyncrasy will present itself to him as both normative and natural, and will not impede the cultivation of an exemplary character nor the maintenance of perfect health, although his trajectory through existence is rendered arduous due to the insurmountable impediments to the gratification of his amorous disposition. Two distinct avenues remain open to him. He may evolve into an active practitioner of deviation, in which instance he invites the opprobrium of society, for he is unfaithful to his civic obligation by failing to utilize the surplus of his vital force for the preservation of the collective, dissipating it instead through conduits that cannot result in reproduction. Furthermore, any sexual aberration is exceedingly contagious due to the potency of suggestion, whether by example or instruction, and would incite other normative individuals toward similar antisocial conduct. It is this profound instinct for species perpetuation that engenders the repugnance and ire of the normal individual regarding all manifestations of abnormality. The afflicted subject, however, may alternatively become a latent deviant, repressing into his subconscious mind those desires he perceives as illicit. He attempts to pursue a conventional existence, yet the adult modality of sexuality affords him no satisfaction, and within his innermost psyche, he truly craves the aberrant form which he ought to have transcended and abandoned. This inclination, being prohibited by the internal censor from entering conscious awareness, seeks recourse through symbolic expression, thereby generating various forms of psychosis and neuroticism. An individual may be maturing quite normally when a trauma, frequently of minor magnitude or some excessive environmental duress, may artificially arrest his development. He will subsequently endure phases remarkably similar to those of the latent deviant, yet possessing superior mental constitution initially, he will typically incline toward neurotic pathology rather than insanity. Those entrusted with the guardianship of children must exercise caution not to inflict trauma by administering a severe rebuke when the child's curiosities and activities assume an undesirable configuration. Such measures accord the matter undue prominence within the child's psyche and may precipitate a cessation of development at the specific phase typified by the undesirable activity. Elucidation and counsel prove far more efficacious than admonition, leaving no deleterious sequelae. An individual may attain normal adulthood with impunity, yet should his energies discover no outlet upon that plane due to the exigencies of circumstance, he may regress to one of the primitive phases through which he has previously transitioned, thereby acquiring a perversion of sexual habit attended by the same susceptibilities to disease as previously noted. Excessive sexual indulgence may result in an attenuated capacity to respond to standard sexual stimuli, prompting the individual to deliberately turn toward abnormal modes of gratification in the anticipation of achieving satiety. Chapter 13. The sublimation of instinctual energy. Were an instinct to be denied its expression and all concepts associated with it be repressed into the subconscious, discord shall inevitably ensue. The lower tributaries of a river may be evacuated by the elementary expedient of positioning a dam across its channel. Yet, this does not resolve the predicament of the surplus water, which accumulates pressure behind the obstruction until it breaches its banks and renders a morass of the upper regions. Should it prove requisite to divert a river from its bed, then an alternative course must be provided, for the waters continue to descend from the highlands and must, by some agency, be accommodated. It is precisely this hydrodynamic conundrum that the psychotherapist is compelled to address. We recognize that a significant proportion of mental and nervous disorders are attributable to the repression of the sexual instinct. This profound instinct, in its psychological and physiological aspects, is so fundamental and so potent that it cannot, with safety to the individual, be wholly stifled, nor, with safety to society, be accorded unbridled license. We find ourselves upon the horns of a dilemma, for societal ordinances demand that it shall only be expressed under severely restricted conditions, those of legal marriage, and even then not to an unlimited degree, whereas nature demands that it shall be expressed as soon as the physical organs of its manifestation are sufficiently matured to function. The typical male resolves this problem for himself by colluding in the maintenance of a pariah class of women, whose very existence is socially disregarded and constitutes a fecund source of misery, pathology, and criminality. However, for women, unless they are prepared irrevocably to enter that pariah caste, a social safety valve does not exist, and we discern among them a markedly superior prevalence than among men of those suffering from nervous afflictions that are consequent to a repression of the sexual instinct. This holds equally true for men who, whether born of idealism or an apprehension of disease, do not avail themselves of such a compromise. This predicament would demonstrate itself as intractable in the future as it has in the past, were it not that we have now ascertained that the law of the transmutation of energy from one form to another is as immutable for psychology as it is for physics. The conversion is technically designated as sublimation. This stands as one of the paramount revelations of modern psychology, for it furnishes the resolution to grave societal problems that menace the very tapestry of civilization. In what manner, regarding practical application, might this result be realized? Primarily, by fundamentally altering our entire attitude toward sexuality and acknowledging that a dilemma is not rectified by ignoring its existence. Secondarily, by extracting the sexual problem from the domain of the subconscious into the conscious mind and confronting it candidly, thereby acquiring dominion over it through the practice of thought control, transmuting our emotions rather than repressing them. Tertiary, by supplying a conduit of creative interest down which may flow the energies we desire to deflect from their primordial channel of manifestation. The crux of the entire matter lies in this. The vital force directs itself toward the focal point of interest. Should the interest and attention be concentrated upon physical sensation, then the vital force will flow or attempt to flow through the channel of the reproductive organs, or if denied manifestation, will maintain a perpetual agitation and stimulation. Conversely, were the interest transposed to an emotional or intellectual plane, there the life force shall find an outlet in creative activity upon these levels and alleviate the pressure from the physical. The mental and physical habits of a lifetime are not dismantled with facility. Nevertheless, if the thoughts be patiently and persistently diverted from physical sensation and concentrated upon exterior concerns, the law of mental and physical habit will come to our aid, and the life force will learn to flow through its new channel with safety to the individual and benefit to society. The process of thought control must not be conflated with the dissociation of ideas. In dissociation, we practice dishonesty with ourselves, repudiating the fact that certain qualities exist within our natures. The ideas connected with them are repressed into our subconsciousness, and it is the involuntary subconscious censor that suppresses them. In thought control, we acknowledge the primordial aspect of our natures and commence the task of disciplining it. And because we are cognizant that dwelling upon mental imagery of a sexual nature induces a physiological reaction, we exclude these concepts from consciousness, Yet in this instance, the suppression is not into the subconscious mind, but into the foreconscious, and it is one of the voluntary censors that enforces the mandate and remains under our dominion. The distinction between repression and dissociation must be explicitly retained in mind throughout all re-educational endeavors. Do you want access to this and all the complete audiobooks on the channel, plus the ebook version? Click the link in the description or scan the QR code in the left corner of the screen to access our library, where you can listen to your favorite esoteric books without ad interruptions, lock your screen, or use other apps while the narration plays, and even download the ebook version to follow along as you listen. Listen on your computer via web browser, or download the app from the Play Store. After subscribing, you will receive an email with your login details, password, and step-by-step instructions on how to access the books through the Hotmart app.